Welcome to Korea and the World, a podcast on political, economic, and social issues from the perspective of the Korean Peninsula.
The newest textbook controversy currently shaking up South Korean politics is a stark reminder that defining history and writing about history is neither neutral nor apolitical. The Korean government is drawing heavy criticism for its attempt to unify all teaching materials into a single, state-commissioned textbook. The move triggered nationwide protests, including over 15,000 educators across the country and a petition signed by over 300 professors from the nation's top universities. To provide context and shed light on these history wars between Japan and Korea, and within Korea itself, we decided to take a step back from today's controversies and had the privilege of interviewing Professor Henry Im. He recently published The Great Enterprise, Sovereignty and Historiography in Modern Korea, in which he explains how Meiji Japan surveyed Korea's history in order to find aspects of its past that would justify imperial control over Korea. Professor Im also shows how post-colonial South Korea then promoted a national counter-narrative of its own with the goal of attaining equal standing among sovereign nations in the New World Order. Henry Im is Associate Professor of Korean Studies at the Underwood International College of Yonsei University. He was previously Fulbright Senior Scholar to Korea, as well as Associate Professor at NYU. Professor Im earned his BA and MA in East Asian Studies, as well as his PhD in History from the University of Chicago. Professor Henry Im, welcome to Korea and the World.
Well, thank you very much.
Today we are going to discuss the concept of sovereignty. First of all, what sparked your interest in these subjects?
I was reading an article about the First Sino-Japanese War in and around Korea in 1894, 1895. Japan defeats China. It's going to be followed about 10 years later by the Russo-Japanese War. And both of these wars would be for control over Korea. I was reading about the Sino-Japanese War, and a Korean historian was criticizing Japanese claims at that time that Japan had, for the first time in Korean history, helped Korea become an independent sovereign state. That is to say, Korea had always been a subject state, tributary state to China, and that for the first time in its history, through Japan's victory over China in the Sino-Japanese War, Japan had helped Korea gain independence. I thought that was quite interesting, and then started to look more deeply into it.
Before going any further, could you maybe explain the concept of sovereignty to our listeners?
I think the point of departure would be the concept of Westphalian sovereignty, full authority and power over a polity where no other side power could claim some sort of authority. So, for example, for a local principality, a peasant might pay taxes to a certain duke or lord, but sort of final political authority might rest with a king or emperor. But at the same time, over the spiritual realm, authority over sort of religious matters would rest with the priest, the bishop, and the pope in Rome. And so the Westphalian sovereignty is the notion that you would have a full legitimacy and power over a polity. That's the point of departure for thinking about sovereignty. And when Japan, during the Sino-Japanese War, claimed that Korea was not a sovereign power, that's precisely the kind of definition that Japan had in mind.
You open and close your book discussing Korean poet and literary critic Kim Ki-rim, and specifically an essay he wrote in 1932. Mm-hmm. Could you maybe tell us more about this essay and how it pertains to sovereignty?
This is an early 1930s essay. As happened frequently during the colonial period, male writers were writing about women's liberation. In short, Kim Ki-rim was calling on the younger generation of Korean women to cut their hair short into the bob cut. And that cutting of the hair would be an act of liberation from patriarchy, a liberation from being subordinate to men, etc. The cutting of hair obviously goes further back to the late 19th century. Japan would be first, where the Meiji authorities forced the cutting of hair for adult men. In Korea, it happened in the mid-1890s, soon after the Sino-Japanese War. And so the cutting of the hair would be associated with personal sovereignty, individual sovereignty, precisely in the sense that that top knot was said to be associated with ties to family and extended family and to the past. And so the cutting of the hair, the cutting of the top knot for men in the 1890s would be cutting such ties so that a man, as an individual, would stand alone and sovereign. That idea is what Kim Gi-rim was also getting at in the early 1930s, that women should be sovereign.
So sovereignty is not just a fact of states. Every entity can have, or actually not have, sovereignty.
Right, and I think this was what I was trying to problematize, both state sovereignty and individual sovereignty. And the argument I was making about sovereignty was that the idea of sovereignty and the idea, for example, of independence actually facilitated imperialist penetration and intervention.
Sovereignty, as you just mentioned, comes from Westphalia, especially in the way we understand it today. 1648, it was not certainly in Asia. How did it travel from Europe all the way to Northeast Asia?
The initial answer to your question would have to focus on, I think, texts and translation. So in other words, texts on international law, how it was first translated into classical Chinese in China, and then how such texts circulated throughout East Asia, and at what point ideas about international law and sovereignty come to be sort of discussed and known, not only in China, Japan, but also in Korea. But in terms of how the idea of sovereignty becomes really a crucial political issue, comes at the time of the Sino-Japanese War again. For me, the event that really sort of captures the different aspects of sovereignty was when King Kojong, the king of Korea at that time, went to the Royal Ancestral Temple in January 1895 in the Gregorian calendar. And before the spirit chambers of his ancestors, the King Taejo, who had founded the Joseon dynasty, and successive kings, how at that Royal Ancestral Temple, King Kojong takes an oath. And the oath is that Joseon Korea is independent of China. Now, the very interesting thing about this is that the Japanese minister, potentiary, Inoue Kaoru, had come to Korea in December of 1894. And Inoue Kaoru is a genro, one of the handful of elder statesmen in Meiji Japan. The very next day after his arrival in Seoul, he demanded an audience with King Kojong, presented him with a list of demands, and on the top of that list was the demand that King Kojong go to the Royal Ancestral Temple and take an oath to declare that Korea is an independent country. The interesting question here is, Japan is engaged in a war with China, and the aim really is for Japan to incorporate Korea into its sphere of influence, if not its line of sovereignty. And Japan is fighting this war against China. Many people did not expect Japan to win the war, but Japan defeated China very clearly, both on land and at sea. So if the central aim is for Japan to gain control over Korea, why is Inoue Kaoru's one of his foremost demands that King Kojong declare that Korea is an independent sovereign country? And it's really this that got me to thinking that international law, but specifically sovereignty and the idea of independence, actually facilitated imperial control. So in this case, in 1894-1895, Japan wanted King Kojong to declare Korea to be independent. And that actually facilitates greater control on the part of the Japanese Empire over Korea, precisely because, for one, Korea now has publicly accepted acting within Western international law, and by declaring that it is an independent sovereign power, no longer will seek aid and support from the Qing Empire. And so having Korea declare itself sovereign and independent allows Japan to gain greater control over Korea, for example, through treaties, making Korea accept advisors, etc., etc. And all of this would be done through treaties, through international law, which would also then make it harder for Western imperial powers to intervene. But in fact, a number of the Western imperial powers did intervene, and that was obviously the triple intervention, led by Russia, but also supported by France and Germany.
By having King Kojong proclaim the independence of Korea from China, in essence, Korea is separated from the sphere of influence of China. But what about prior to that announcement, during the Joseon dynasty and before that? Was Korea independent, or was it rather limited as a vassal of China?
So for much of the Joseon period, 1392 to 1910, Korea was a tributary state to the Chinese Empire. And in fact, Joseon Korea is often pointed to as the model tributary state, a model for the other tributary states. So being a tributary state is obviously not based on equal sovereignty, as in Westphalian sovereignty. It is clearly, in a symbolic way, a hierarchical relationship. So this hierarchical relationship, manifests itself in a number of different ways. So for example, whereas in Joseon Korea you had the royal ancestral temple and the altars to the land and grain, the Joseon state did not establish a temple to heaven. And the idea there is that only the Son of Heaven could officiate sacrifices to heaven. And there is only one Son of Heaven.
We write that sovereignty is at the nexus between imperialism and nationalism. Can you maybe explain what you mean by that?
That was what I was trying to get at with that example of Inoue Kaoru demanding of King Kojong that he declare Korea to be an independent and sovereign state. There are perhaps at least a couple of things that we should keep in mind here then. One is that the concept of sovereignty, this post-Westphalian notion of sovereignty, is not something that's just developed within and emerges within Europe and then is disseminated and spread throughout the world. The notion of sovereignty, and of course international law itself, is something that emerges, that gets developed and articulated and re-articulated within a longer history of imperial expansion and competition. That is to say, the notion of sovereignty is something that gets developed over the centuries in the context of European powers competing against one another over control over colonial or not yet colonial places. And so the notion of sovereignty itself is deeply implicated in the history of imperialism. That's one thing. And the second thing for us to keep in mind is that there was never this golden age when nation states were able to exercise or have full sovereignty. Sovereignty is something that was always negotiated, and nation states would willingly give up parts of its sovereignty. And that's a good thing, actually. So for example, a country might sign an international convention on human rights, or the rights of women or children, or maybe a state might sign an agreement on aviation or laws of the sea. In signing these international conventions or agreements, in a sense, nation states give up parts of its sovereignty by agreeing to abide by international rules and regimes. And I think these are good things. So I think what's happening at the very end of the 19th century in Korea is that this notion of sovereignty is something that is being used as a tool by the Japanese Empire for greater control over Korea. For historians, what the interesting question then becomes is the process by which this notion of sovereignty becomes fundamental to modern Korean politics or modern nationalist politics, because sovereignty becomes the central aim to Korean nationalists' desire and what they would devote their lives to and sometimes give up their lives for. So sovereignty becomes the central foundational part of not just modern Korean politics, but I would say modern politics and much of the colonial world.
So how does sovereignty become a part of nationalism? How do people start caring about it?
I think it takes a little while. In terms of nation and nationalism, the word in Korean would be 민족. And the word itself is a neologism. That is to say, it's a new word, a new compound. this new compound is first created by Japanese intellectuals, actually, in the 1880s in translating the word nation. And so the character for people, min, and a different character for grouping, zoku, were brought together to translate nation, so minzoku. The word minjok is first used at the very beginning of the 20th century, around 1900, in Korea. And it takes a little while for this new word to get a sort of a fixed meaning. I think today many people would have a negative view of nationalism, and to a great extent for quite valid reasons. That it tends to be totalizing. It does not allow for recognition and appreciation of difference within one nation, etc. But the other thing that sometimes we forget, I think, is the inclusive and democratic aspect of this word and this idea of 민족, nation. With this word, what you get is a much more inclusive politics, which is, I would say, modern politics. With this word, it becomes possible for, let's say, a scholar official, a yangban, to, for example, speak with a peasant, an illiterate peasant, or perhaps even an illiterate peasant woman, and to speak to that person using polite speech, and to say something like that we are all Korean. That's nationalism. That is a kind of politics that's unimaginable for Joseon status society. Now, the Joseon dynasty is a very long-lived dynasty, one of the most long-lived dynasties, I think, in world history, 5 centuries. And for the scholar officials throughout the Joseon dynasty, one key to stability was the reproduction of status difference. That is to say, you have stability when yangban will act like yangban, and commoners act like commoners should, and the nobi, the unfree, the outcasts, remain that way. With the Joseon society premised on the reproduction of that kind of status differences, it will not and it could not take a pedagogic attitude toward the people to say something like, we are all of one nation. But 민족, this concept of 민족, allows for that. And so that the people, the ethnic nation, is invited into history, and invited into history as the subject of that history. The people who actually make that history. That is to say, Korean history is not the history of the dynasty, of the royal family, but history of the Korean people. That's nationalist historiography that I discuss in the book, and that's nationalist politics. So, in the earlier example of sovereignty, King Gojong, as you remember, goes to the royal ancestral temple. Now, that royal ancestral temple and the altars to the land and grain, in a sense, they symbolize the Joseon state itself. To preserve and protect the royal ancestral temple and the altars to the land and grain is to preserve and protect Joseon Korea. But that royal ancestral temple belongs to the royal family. It is not the temple to the Korean people, right? It's the first ancestral tablet is the tablet for the founder of the Yi dynasty, Joseon, Korea, and successive kings. The country literally belongs to the king. 민족, and this concept of ethnic nation, says the country belongs to the Korean people. And so there is already a suggestion here of republican politics. And that's precisely what you get by the time you get to 1919 and the March 1st movement and the establishment of a provisional government in Shanghai. These activists are going to create a republican Korea and not restore the monarchy. And so there is, I would say, this inclusive democratic component to nationalism that sometimes today we tend to forget. But this concept of nation, 민족, was appealing, I think, precisely because it invited everyone, male, female, old, young, literate and illiterate, into history as a subject of history. And that's the kind of history that the first generation of nationalist historians were writing.
So you just mentioned that Japan was a country which created the word 민족 in Korea, but why did they do that? What was the point?
I think for the Japanese Empire, the word 민족구, 민족, becomes quite complicated. It gets complicated precisely because in the act of empire building, it incorporates what is today Taiwan, Korea, and then other parts of what is now China. And so for the Japanese Empire, Minzoku has both this exclusive but also inclusive aspect. That is to say, at certain times during the colonial period, even when referencing, let's say, the Yamato Minzoku, sometimes that phrase was meant to be understood as inclusive of Koreans. And so for Japan, it's much more complicated. But for Korea, Minzoku, Minjok, maintains a anti-colonial, or at least a separate and distinct marker vis-a-vis the Japanese Empire.
You write in your book that as part of this enterprise of empire building, Japan also changed Korean history and were the first to start a Korean historiography. How did they do that?
The first thing we might keep in mind is that as Japan embarked on empire building, Japanese historians, one of the first things they did was to problematize the notion of Japanese history as history of the Japanese archipelago. That is to say, by going back to some of the very early mythical narratives, some Japanese historians would point out that the history of Japan should not be limited to just the islands, the archipelago, but that in fact, in the distant past, Japanese history included significant portions of, for example, the Korean Peninsula. It is this kind of expansive kind of spatial imaginary that also, I think, is adopted by also the first generation of Korean nationalist historians. So, for example, nationalist historians like Shin Che-ho raised the question that when we think about Korean history, that Korean history should not be just limited to the peninsula. That in fact, for example, if you were to go back as far back, at least as the Three Kingdoms period, and obviously previous to that, that what is Korea includes not just the Korean Peninsula, but vast areas of what we might call Manchuria. And that in fact, the origin of the Korean people actually is in Manchuria. And sort of rethinking the spatial limits of Korean history.
It seems that somehow the Japanese authorities decide that 6th century Shilla Korea is the apex of Korean cultural history. Why is that? What's so special about the Shilla dynasty?
Here, I think the larger question might have to do with how we understand colonial power. That is to say, most often within South Korea and also in North Korea, colonial power, I think, is seen in the negative sense, in that colonial power has to do with prohibiting the formation of political groups, suppression, censorship, not that kind of both coercive power that has largely to do with preventing people from doing something, sort of repressive, suppressive power. But I think if we think about what Japanese authorities did for bringing attention to the achievements of Shilla, etc., I think we really need to think much more carefully about what we might think of as positive aspects of colonial power. And here, positive not in the sense that it's good, but positive in the sense that it's not just repressive and restrictive and prohibitive, but it's the colonial power also has to do with creating something. That is to say, creating a narrative. Japanese colonial authorities spent a great deal of time, energy, and resources in creating narratives about Korea. So, for example, in the second part of my book, I discuss how right at the time of Japan's annexation of Korea in 1910, at fairly significant expense, the Japanese Empire goes about restoring the Sakuram, the Buddha, and also Purguksa. So these Buddhist temples and these sites that date back to the time of Shilla. Now the question would be, Japan is still engaged in counterinsurgency military operations against the righteous armies that had sprung up throughout the Korean Peninsula. And it's not like the Japanese Empire have a great deal of resources that it can spend on restoring Korean Buddhist temples, etc. But even before these military operations conclude, like around 1913 or so, Japan has begun these restoration projects of Sakuram and etc. And not only that, they publish it. They publish books and articles about the artistic achievements of Shilla Korea. Why would a colonial power do something like that? Why would the Japanese colonial authorities praise the architecture and the art history of Korean people at the time of Shilla? I mean, it's a double-edged sword because it then creates a narrative where you say, look, Koreans can be proud and justifiably proud of this wonderful artistic achievement at the time of Shilla. But then there was this sort of fall during the Goryeo dynasty and the Joseon dynasty. The art and culture of Korea declines. And so the restoration of these sites, the restoration of Seokguram, the restoration of Bulguksa, serves as a symbol and an example for the world, actually, and for Koreans in Korea, of Japan's intentions in Korea, that Koreans are not capable of meeting the challenges of modernity. And just as the Japanese Empire will restore these ancient sites, that the Japanese Empire will restore the Korean people. And many of the Korean intellectuals, the non-nationals, found this kind of narrative very difficult to argue against.
To paraphrase, it was essentially a way to legitimize their mission civilisatrice.
Absolutely, I think that's right.
Korean intellectuals of the time, how did they deal with it? Was there anything that... Did they try to write a counter-history? Was there any movement against that?
I think the answer would be yes and no, because it becomes fairly clear once you get into the 1920s that such preservation or restoration projects have a very specific focus. So in other words, what gets preserved and what gets restored is first of all decided by the colonial authorities. And obviously things that could be rallying point for kind of nationalist politics obviously would not be restored. So whether it be certain figures, let's say Lee Sun-shin or something, those aspects of Korean history would be neglected, not preserved. Now this civilizing mission that you mentioned, the problem with that is that on the colonial authorities might be preserving or restoring some ancient relics, ancient sites in Korea. On the other hand, racial hierarchy and racism is very clear, very blatant. And so there is an inherent contradiction to the colonial project here, as with other colonialisms. In this case, the idea was that Koreans would be incorporated into this Japanese empire and that Koreans would be treated on an equal basis. On the other hand, clearly there is racism. And this contradiction persists throughout the colonial period, from beginning all the way to the end. Now, what Korean nationalists and what Koreans remember most is probably toward the end of the colonial period, when colonial policy shifts to one where, for example, Korean language is no longer taught in the schools, starting in the 1930s. In the late 1930s, Koreans are pressured to adopt Japanese surnames, and Korean identity is being sort of suppressed. The name of the policy that provided the sort of theoretical and legal framework for that kind of forced assimilation was the policy of Nai Sen Itai. The first two characters, Nai and Sen. Nai stands for Japan, but the character for Japan is the character for the inside. And Sen is the second character for Joseon, Korea. And so Japan as the inside, as the center, and Korea, Joseon, Itai, meaning as one body. Japan and Korea as one body. That's the policy for the late colonial period, where Koreans are being very forcefully sort of assimilated into being one with and being loyal subjects of the Japanese emperor, etc. But I think that policy of assimilation itself, the name of that policy itself, points to the contradiction that cannot be resolved. That is to say, yes, Japan and Korea is declared to be one, as in one body. But Japan was and will remain the inside to which Korea will be attached. And so in the moment that Japan and Korea is declared to be one, there's still very clearly the notion that Japan, though, however, is always the center.
So what is the link between history writing and sovereignty, both during the colonial era and afterwards, once Korea was independent?
Perhaps we can start at the very first decade of the 20th century, on the eve of Japan's colonization of Korea. So the first decade of the 20th century. Sovereignty, and here we're talking about Westphalian notion of sovereignty and of equal sovereignty. This notion of sovereignty creates a kind of historical imaginary where the first generation of nationalist historians emerging in Korea in the first decade of the 20th century would then go back and rethink Korean history. We said before, both in spatial terms, like Korean history not being bounded by the peninsula, but that it incorporates actually this vast area up in Manchuria, but also what is uniquely Korean. And here, there might be a couple of ways to illustrate this. For example, throughout the Joseon dynasty, two figures remain very important in terms of how the Joseon dynasty and historians trace a kind of cultural and political genealogy. One figure is Dangun, and the other figure is Kija. And during the Joseon dynasty, both figures, but especially Kija, are revered. That is to say, during the Joseon period, Kija is not problematic and is not problematized, even though on first reading, Kija is quote-unquote not Korean. Right? He is part of the aristocracy of the Zhou dynasty, who, along with his retainers then, are allowed to and sent east, where Kija comes to Joseon. And Kija is then seen as a civilizer, spreading, to put it very simply, Chinese institutions and culture to Korea. So Kija as a civilizing figure, but also Dangun. And so both are venerated. Dangun allows Korea to make a direct claim to origins in heaven. Now, Dangun, if you recall, was a son of Hwanung, who is in turn son of the Lord of Heaven. And Dangun establishes the first Joseon, that is to say, Korea. This allows the Joseon dynasty to trace its legitimacy all the way to Dangun, who is contemporaneous with Yao and Shun, that is to say, the mythical founders of China. In other words, Korea has an autonomous and unique origin that traces directly to heaven itself, where Dangun, as a descendant of heaven, was the first to receive the mandate of heaven. And that mandate of heaven then is handed down through successive dynasties and monarchs to contemporary Joseon dynasty monarchs. So on the one hand, Korea can claim this autonomous genealogy. On the other hand, it has no problems in venerating Kija, who has a link with China. And that is to say, while Korea has an autonomous origins, it is also part of a China-centered world. And at that time, it is not a bad thing to be a part of the China-centered world. Perhaps the contemporary equivalent might be of countries that want to be a part of Euro-American civilization, precisely because of its affluence and its cultural achievements. And so that in Joseon's time, to be outside of that China-centered world would be to be outside of civilization. Now, for that first generation of nationalist historians, and with this notion of sovereignty, the challenge then is to remove those aspects of Korean history and historical figures that would not have been problematic during the Joseon period, but now becomes problematic. A kind of a decentering of China to separate out what is Korean and what is not Korean. And so, with the writing system itself, Korean scholar officials and scholars have been using the classical Chinese, literary Chinese, for 1500 years or more. Suddenly, this writing system, classical Chinese, becomes Chinese, becomes not ours. And that's because of the politics of the late 19th and early 20th century. On the other hand, this alphabet, this phonetic writing system, the vernacular writing system, that is today called Hangul, was referred to as Unmun. It was feminized. It did not have that kind of prestige of literary Chinese. But in 1895, that writing system is declared Gungmun, right, the national script. There is this decentering of China going on and a rewriting of history where history is rewritten with a view to separating out what is uniquely Korean and what is not. So I think that effort is set in motion by the notions of post-Westphalian sovereignty that comes to be the only sort of game in time starting in the late 19th century throughout East Asia.
As we discussed earlier, Japanese scholars focused on Shilla and then its decline. What about modern Korean historians? What did they focus on in their enterprise to differentiate between China and Korea?
Well, now, if we think about historians and history writing in South Korea since 1945, a number of decades have passed. And I think South Korean historians in the 1970s and 1980s, one of their critique was that histories written by South Korean historians in the immediate post-liberation, post-1945 period was still very much influenced and colored by colonial historiography. The seminal essay is a 1961 essay by Lee Gi-baek, where he lays out 4 characteristics of colonialist historiography. So one, the notion that Korean history was stagnant, that nothing really happened for many, many centuries. The active subject, that Korean history sort of changed always from the outside, whether it's the Chinese or whether it's the Mongols or the Manchus, etc. That Korean politics always sort of riven and divided by factional politics, so forth and so on. Professor Lee Gi-baek, he was a center-right conservative politician. And this critique of colonial historiography remained influential for many decades. I think what happened starting in the late 1970s, 1980s was the recognition that this kind of critique of colonial historiography is actually very much part of and possible within a Cold War framework. That is to say, critique of colonialism is limited to critique of Japanese colonialism and Japanese empire, whereas American influence after 1945 is not mentioned. For, let's say, critical historians in the 1970s and 1980s, the overriding question was, how did Korea come to be divided in 1945, and how did that division of Korea become permanent? That is to say, what is the history that leads up to the creation of 2 Koreas, and which then leads to this catastrophic civil war that was the Korean War that remains unended to this day?
What answers have been found for that question? Is there an hegemonic discourse on what happened, or is it divided maybe along political lines?
That question obviously is very much in the news today, and that is to say, this is one of the most contested political issues for South Korea. In fact, this has been referred to as the history wars, and these history wars have been very intense. Obviously, most recently, this has gone to the point where the current government, the Park Geun-hye government, and the Ministry of Education has decided that history textbooks for junior and senior high schools would be only state-issued history textbooks. The current system is one in which a number of publishers publish their own textbooks written by different groups of historians. These textbooks then would be examined and then approved by the Institute for Korean History, and then final certification by the Ministry of Education. And so all of these textbooks must be approved and then certified. And once they are certified, local schools are then free to choose among 7 or 8 different textbooks. And oftentimes that is decided by the principal of the school, but usually upon consultation with the teachers who actually teach the histories.
Currently, the textbooks have been criticized for being too much on the left, according to the government, but what seems interesting is that over time, affinities and sensitivities concerning history and historiography seem to change in parties. You write that since the 1980s, the political right would strongly criticize culture which, inspired by post-colonial theory, would narrate the colonial period as an epic Manichaean struggle between righteous exploited Koreans and the evil Japanese Empire. But then, since 2006, a book was published called Re-examination of Korean History Before and After Liberation, which very much did the same, and this time the conservatives seem to applaud it. What has changed?
Here we've been talking about conservatives and maybe progressives, but perhaps it might be useful if we sort of make somewhat finer distinctions, as those historians themselves might. On the conservative side, or on the right, there are self-identified so-called new right that distinguish themselves from the old right. The new right come together in a conscious or self-conscious way in the early years of the 21st century, in the 2000s. That is to say, during the liberal governments led by Kim Dae-jung and then Roh Moo-hyun. The new right distinguish themselves from the old right in the sense that they claim that they are less state-centric. They would privilege the individual and not the state. The new right came together as a group out of fear of the direction that they saw the Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun administrations taking. So to take 2 examples, the summit meetings between Kim Dae-jung and the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-il, and also between Roh Moo-hyun and Kim Jong-il. also efforts during those two administrations, or at least debate about getting rid of national security law, which says that if you were to praise or side with enemy organizations, which is North Korea, you are in violation of national security law and you can be prosecuted, sent to jail, etc. The two liberal left-of-center governments of Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun is what brings the so-called the New Right together. In the series that you mentioned, 해방 전후사의 재인식, reconsideration, it brought together, I think, in a somewhat surprising way, both these New Right scholars, along with some, you might say, post-colonial theorists and scholars. And I think on the part of some of these post-colonial theorists and scholars, once the series came out and they realized what the politics of some of the New Right scholars were, they had very deep misgivings of having their articles included in the series. But at any rate, for the New Right and beyond the New Right to some of the conservative dailies, post-colonial theory was welcomed indeed embraced, precisely because of post-colonialism's critique of nationalism, nationalist narratives. And here, obviously, we're simplifying a great deal, but post-colonial theory and scholarship, which took a critical view of nationalism and nationalist politics, including progressive nationalist politics of the 1980s, for being too totalizing, not allowing for recognizing difference, that the progressive left was itself authoritarian, and that the kind of radical democracy that was being called for on the post-colonial left was at odds with the kind of nationalist politics of the progressive left of the 1980s. And this kind of critique, obviously, was really welcomed by conservatives. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, for the progressive left of the 1980s, I would say they had some misgivings about post-colonialism precisely because of this kind of questioning about nationalism. And so the kind of mapping that needs to be done here perhaps is very necessary, because in Korea, you have so-called New Right that is critical of nationalism. In how many parts of the world do you see the right being critical of nationalism? On the one hand. On the other hand, you see progressives from the 1980s, who is often described and also self-described as being nationalist. So in how many places in the world do you see progressives being nationalist? But this is precisely because of the particularity and the specifics of South Korean intellectual and political history coming through the Cold War and to the present.
Could you tell us more about this process?
In terms of the conservative critique of the current history textbooks being used in the schools, the government and conservative critique of these textbooks are that they are left-leaning or they are socialist, that the historical perspective here in these textbooks are very similar, if not identical, for example, to the historical perspective of the South Korean Workers' Party. And that's directly from an editorial in Joseon-ilbo. And that it establishes a negative perspective on South Korean history that is bad for the younger generation. What's considered leftist historical perspective here is linked to the question raised earlier. And that is the question of how is it that today you have two Koreas? How is it that you had this catastrophic Korean War? And how is it that the Korean War remains unended? And the historians in the 70s and 80s went about the question in a number of ways. One is, Korea was divided into two and occupied by American and Soviet forces from 1945 to 1948. But one of the narratives that was offered was that the division of Korea and the Korean War is the result of superpower rivalry. That is to say, Korea got caught up in a struggle, a maelstrom that was not of their own making. That Korea became a victim of this confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States. And these, the critical historians, for example, Kang Man-gil, who taught at Korea University, made the point that the Korean War was different from the Sino-Japanese War or the Russo-Japanese War, the turn of the previous century. Sino-Japanese War of 1894-1895, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. These were wars waged by surrounding powers over Korea for Korea. But that does not capture a central character, a fundamental character of post-1945 Korean politics and the Korean War. That in very important respects, the Korean War was a civil war, a war that was like a denouement of political cleavages that have their roots in the colonial period. And so yes, while Korea was divided and occupied by Soviet and American forces from 45 to 48, they also asked the question, which Korean political groups or politicians were responsible for the creation of two Koreas, the establishment of separate states, etc. And one of the conclusions that these critical historians came to was that Seungman Rhee, as much as Kim Il-sung, was responsible for the creation of two separate states. Now, for the conservatives, this is anathema because the critical historiography of the 1970s and 1980s problematize the 1948 UN-sponsored elections that created South Korea in the first place. They would point out, for example, why Kim Gu was deeply conservative and anti-communist nationalist, boycotted the UN-sponsored elections in 1948, opposed these elections, and attended a conference in Pyongyang that tried to create an alternative path for creating a unified Korea. For the new right, they would problematize a nationalist like Kim Gu for having opposed the 1948 UN-sponsored elections that created South Korea, because he opposed the creation of South Korea. And the progressive critical historians of the 70s and 80s who problematized the 1948 elections then would be seen also as people who are questioning, quote-unquote, the legitimacy of South Korea. Now, these progressive historians are not attacking South Korea's sovereignty, but they are bringing the attention to the process by which two Koreas were created, and by extension, the process by which the Korean War might finally be brought to an end through a process of reconciliation, a process by which then South and North Korea might be unified precisely through a process of reconciliation rather than a process of South Korea absorbing North Korea.
Would you say that sovereignty as a concept has served for the good of people or rather to oppress them?
What I've tried to point out in this book is that it's the answer has to be both a yes and no. On the one hand, especially in the late 19th century, but perhaps also in the period 1948 onwards, the concept of sovereignty could actually facilitate imperialist penetration and greater control. But on the other hand, and I think as history has shown, when we think about human rights or people's rights, and here the example would be, for example, the 일진회 of the first decade of the 20th century, where their slogans were people's rights, 민권, but also a kind of Pan-Asianism, where the 일진회 was willing to accept the leadership of Japan, assuming and or hoping that Japan would guarantee and preserve Joseon Korea's sovereignty. But I think in retrospect, it's quite clear that particular constellation of agendas did not work, and that ultimately state sovereignty guarantees people's rights or individual rights. Now, for the most part, today I think, especially I think within the context of American political thought, that individual rights are something to be protected vis-a-vis state power. And I would agree with that, but we also should keep in mind that it's state power that is supposed to also guarantee rights. So my right not to be discriminated against on the basis of gender or religion or race. And so sovereignty, which has this complicated history and complicated genealogy in Korean history because of its association with concepts like nation, 민족, has, I think, this two-sidedness that we have to keep in mind. Both its sort of historical affiliation and complicity with history of imperialism, both in the way that the concept of sovereignty developed in the first place, but also the reasons why democracy activists really focus on sovereignty, because it's sovereignty that maintains not just a national autonomy, but also individual autonomy.
Professor Henry Im, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, you're very welcome. I enjoyed this conversation very much.
This was Korea and the World. To make sure you don't miss our next episode, bookmark our website, koreaandtheworld.org, subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter.